Hi, I'm Geraldine Gallagher and I'm the CEO of the Executive Coaching Consultancy, and this is my podcast, Shifting the Needle. Today we're going to talk about leadership and the journey to leadership. And I'd also like to talk a bit about gender diversity, so in the world of diversity, equity and inclusion. And with me today I have a guest who has had 30 years experience in the legal sector. She is a partner at Reed Smith and was the managing partner at Reed Smith. And so I feel she has much that we can learn from. And so I'd like to introduce today Tamara Box.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here, Darlene.
Thank you for coming. Tamara, let's start just, if you could give a brief synopsis of your career. You laugh.
I'm too old for brief.
So a brief synopsis of your career, just bringing out a little bit about the leadership journey.
Sure.
If you could, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, I think I've been very lucky to get to work, in 3 different countries and across, frankly, 6 different organizations. I always think back to my first 10 years as a lawyer. I managed to move either country or firm every 2 years. So I got lots of opportunity at that reinvention, that sort of sense of, how do you kind of leave bits of you and then pick up things you really want to do or be in the next place. And that's probably been a big piece of what I think.
So was that in your
20s?
Leadership.
Yeah, it was. It was.
You moved around a lot.
Yeah, so I went out to Asia. Never been to Asia before in my life, and my firm sent me to Singapore and had an amazing experience. But it was, such a growth experience, and definitely one that, taught me some of that skill of adaptability and, really learning how to roll with the things that come at you. Turns out I really like that. So I suppose that turned me into a bit of what I think of as a startup junkie in a very secure environment. I've always worked largely in large law firms, but nonetheless gotten to, in some cases, either start offices. I did that when I was a 6th-year associate. I started the office of my firm at the time here in London, believe it or not. And I got to come to London and do that. And then I went to a law firm that was associated with an accountancy firm back when that was all the rage and very novel. So I was the 5th partner in and set up the finance practice. And then in most of the other firms I've been in, I've set up a business of some sort.
So a lawyer with an entrepreneurial bent.
I'd say that, yeah. Again, in the safe space that is, sort of mostly big law, to be fair. So it's not quite the same as going out there and really staking it all. But I do love those challenges, really taking on an opportunity and sort of thinking, is that going to work or not? And being brave about that. I think in some respects there is a degree of, in a risk-averse environment, and let's be clear, law attracts mostly risk-averse people, and I'm still one of those. One of those. I'm probably at the far end of that spectrum on taking risks, but a very long way from.
Well, I can relate to that, obviously, having set up executive coaching when I was 34, in fact.
Well done.
So, yes, I don't think I realised how big a risk I was taking, but yeah.
That's when to do it.
That's when to do it, exactly, when you don't worry too much.
You don't know how much it's going to be a risk, exactly.
So let's just talk a little bit about when you moved to being managing partner.
Sure.
And then moved back to being a partner. And just how do you do the job now differently, having been a managing partner? And maybe talk a bit about the skills that you'd honed, maybe some that you had to lose to be a managing partner and some that you had to acquire. Yeah,
I think I'm not sure you lose any, but I certainly think you emphasize different things. As a partner, as a practice group head, etc., that kind of thing, you're very focused on delivering to the clients directly. And I will say I think I am sort of someone who likes to deliver through a team naturally. So I always really took pleasure in building teams and working with people and finding ways to make sure that we were all better. I know what my weaknesses are, so I'm very focused on finding people that have strengths that complement those. And so I think delivering to clients with a great team was always something I really focused on as a partner and as a sort of client facing all the time deliverer. In management, you're a little bit removed, certainly from the direct delivery. But you're not removed from the desire and need to create teams and empower people and make sure they feel really able to go out and be their best. That's the most important thing you can do in business, I think, is make sure that everyone, no, you can't do it. You have to make sure they are doing it, So, and I think that stepping away a bit from that oversight directly and into building enough of a team, building into, confidence in people, making sure they have confidence in themselves. They know, what their role is, to empower them to lead that delivery without you, And so I think that's, for me, that was a big piece of moving into, moving into management. And it's, it's really figuring out what are the things that I can do, what dials or levers can I, sort of turn or pull that are going to make it better and easier for the people who are out there delivering on the front line, to do so. And, sometimes that means, you're coaching, you're mentoring. Sometimes that means you're pushing and cajoling, and sometimes, that actually means you're kind of getting out there and listening a lot to figure out what's going to make things work better, what's going to, smooth the way, erase the friction, whatever it may be. And I found I really enjoyed that part. I really liked the idea that you could have a small intervention, but that from your 3,000 feet you could see, that would really sort of change the outcome, and not change it because you had to get involved. And I have a bit of a bugbear about this management style that's sort of micromanagement, overlooking everyone's shoulder, kind of fear management, if you will, because that often feels like what you're really doing is you're there to catch someone out. Yeah. And I think leadership is the exact opposite. You're there to, you're there to lift them up. You're there to help them move forward. And so that was the part I really enjoyed.
It's that, it's getting that balance right between intervening, but also ensuring that it's coming from them too, and trying to get it right. And in my book that I wrote, I talked a lot about an agentic and a communal style, and how leadership over-indexes on agentic. And then when you get to a leadership position, and you naturally might be agentic, being that sort of push style, needing to get things done, being quite dominant, wanting, seeing what needs to be done. And then you get to a leadership position and find, doesn't work. I actually need to lean into what they're good at.
And look, I don't think there's any chance I can suggest you always get it right. And I will say, I think I have a mix probably of that agentic, because I'm very decisive, so I know that about myself. I will look at something, I tend to be quite quick at, well, this is the way forward. And it's not a lack of listening per se, because I do think it's important to kind of listen to everything, but then I'm decisive. I can't stand hours of conversation and no decision. That makes me insane. That's very common in law firms. It's very common in kind of consensus-driven environments. So take partnerships. That's a natural thing. There's a lot of consultation required to get people to feel included and engaged when they have what they see as a stake in things. And I think that's really valuable, but that often leads to a lack of decision-making. And that makes me just as crazy, frankly, as people who don't listen. So I do have to work really hard at tempering that side of, I can see what you need to do, let me just tell you, and get to the, okay, what do you think you need to get us to this outcome that we've both agreed is, the right outcome, and work through that. And it is a different skill set, when you're leading a team and you're in, kind of client delivery mode. If you're, the lead on the team, then you make the decisions and everyone kind of falls in line. And it doesn't mean you have to be horrible about it, but they do, and they know their roles. It's very different in a partnership. Their role is not necessary, and they certainly don't see it. Their role is not to listen to you per se. They think their role is to have you go execute on their behalf. So there is a very different leadership that happens, I think, in professional services.
I think that I can see that.
And that's work. That's a work in progress, I think, for almost every leader that steps into that. Because on the one hand, now you're the boss. On the other hand, you're exactly not. They are definitely the boss of you when it comes to, they're kind of in, they're in charge in terms of how that business feels. you're really the execution arm in some respects of that in management.
So interesting that actually. I hadn't thought of that before, but in a partnership, you really have to dial up your influencing skills because you
100%.
haven't got the same power and authority in a managing partner role as you do if you're a chief executive.
I won't pretend to speak for all of them, but then in professional services, because we've almost always been in partnership models, that has been a feature of that kind of democratic approach to, your leadership. It's not CEOs who are appointed based on their CVs or the needs and the skill set. So you end up typically, I'd say, not only with partners who are either elected or appointed into those roles by those who are elected, but you also end up with a team that may or may not have all those skill sets. So you really have to start kind of figuring out how do you cultivate the skill sets that you need. And by that I mean, not everyone comes to the table, even though they may be amazing partners and business developers and have incredible client relationships. They won't necessarily come to the table with business skills that you need to run the business as opposed to build their own practices or, deal with their clients. And, that I think has always been a fascination to me that, it's almost amazing that these firms are as successful, as large, as profitable as they are, because it's a bit of a fluke sometimes, how you get there. And, you kind of think, it is, we don't inspect CVs so much. We go on personality traits. We go on who's very successful in the business. Yeah. But that's who's successful in the business they were doing. It's like appointing your salesperson as CEO, right?
Yeah.
That isn't always going to work. Sometimes it does brilliantly, but sometimes that isn't the skill set you need in the CEO or in the
because business development, I always think in terms of partnership as being the move from senior associate to partner. A lot of it is around a book of business and being good at business development. Is that not quite right?
No, I think it is, it's certainly increasingly the case. One of the things I've seen change over my career is we've gone from, an environment in law where we actually did expect people to have very different skills. Very crudely sometimes, the minders, the grinders and the finders, right? You crudely. But the reality was we accepted that some people would be absolutely excellent, in the weeds, in the detail, in the black letter
technical
law,
excellence
in the technical.
Hugely important.
It's hugely important. But we also accepted that the people that might be out there, really cultivating client relationships, that skill set might be different. Yeah. And you put those two together, that's quite important, right? And
quite unusual psychologically.
Very, very. And I think that's where things have changed over time. We used to have rainmaker as a term, and that was a few. Take any other organization, those were your key salespeople. Now, the salespeople knew they were selling a product, right? Yeah. Others delivered and had the technical expertise to deliver the product. Salespeople have to know a lot. You can't sell something you don't understand. Absolutely. But they still knew that they had people who were far better at putting the product together. Yeah. That's much harder in the environment we live in today. We want lawyers to be all things to all people all the time. And to be a partner, you're really expected to have all those skill sets rolled into one. Client-facing skills, real relationships, sales skills, technical expertise, constantly keeping up with everything that's happening in your area of law, but also, frankly, the ability to cross-sell and understand the rest of all of the other practice areas. And it's far less of, in many ways, a team effort if you're not careful. And I think that's where things in law firms become really important about, what are you incentivized to do? How are you, incentivized to collaborate? How does it work when, one of you might be great sales, one of you might be, technical experts? How do you get those two people to go out hunting together, or three or four of them? How do you create the environment for success? Because despite what I think it feels like in, the legal environment right now, no one person can ever deliver, what a client is asking for. None,
it has to be a team effort.
It is always a team effort. And so, you may have the star player, but the reality is it was a team. And I think we're on the edge of maybe forgetting some of that and not having all the incentives run the right way.
And do you think the billable hours culture hinders that move towards team play?
I think it does. I think the billable hours culture hinders a lot, including your client relationships, in my view. So, the simple reality is it will go eventually. Clients, I think, are starting to cotton on that, it is a bit of a silly metric. And it's rather obvious that it is. Not every person is made the same. So despite, having the same skill sets as the person next door, we would approach a task differently and we would take different times to do it. Absolutely. Why would the client be the one bearing the risk of that yes. time frame, right? So I think a lot of our clients are pushing on that now. But it does, because billable hours have become the thing we've used even more so lately, I'd say, as a metric for, valuing our people. The more we push them to bill more hours, of course, the less we are telling them, choose well which ones should be your hours and which ones should be somebody else's hours. And how do we make sure that, the team is actually actively involved in this? How is the right person getting the right work? The right skill set being deployed on the right job. That is, hard to incentivize in an environment that says, above all else, you must bill hours.
I know. Yeah. I can see it. I mean, it's a topic since I've been involved in law firms that just
if you'd asked me a decade ago, I would have said by now there's no way we would have a billable hour. We're far smarter than that. We must have been able to do away with it by now. And I know, we have some, great authors and thinkers in this space that have predicted for some long before now, for some time, that it'd be gone. And it's, it's going, but our whole business models are built on it.
I wonder if AI will have an impact on it.
It is having an impact on it, by definition. Bigger impact than even some of the things, we were doing with efficiencies before that, offshoring and northshoring and all those things that clearly had an impact on, well, wait a minute, if we hire people in, pick a place, our Leeds or India or wherever it may be, that's going to take work out of the mouth of somebody in London or, New York or whatever it is. Well, yes, it did. And that became a whole discussion really around, how effective is a billable hour if we can absolutely reduce it, right? By just being clever and efficient. And now you have a technology, that is driving
It's doing the grinding in some ways.
It is.
Some of the grinding.
And our clients know that. And our clients know that. So you don't have a lot of choice about having to think about a more efficient business, running things
People
better.
know it's there.
The biggest issues for law firms in facing up to that, frankly, is that our whole business model and all of our incentives and the way we value each other internally are entirely built around a billable hour. So we always say to our clients, no, we don't have to do it. We can do alternative fee arrangements. We can do a fixed fee. It's fine. That may be for the client. It's never internal. We still absolutely track ourselves on that billable hour.
And I can see from a training point of view as well, working through the grinding towards the finding and then becoming a partner, that really changes up, doesn't it? Yeah. When a lot of the basic stuff can get done by AI. So how do your trainees learn? Are the trainees of the future going to be the ones that are the most adept at AI? Because my experience, which is very limited with AI, but nonetheless I'm obviously into it. I can see the efficiencies.
It's incredible.
But one of the things I worry about is how I can see something that's AI generated and I can see what's wrong with it because I've got loads of experience. And so I can say, oh, that's not what happened about leadership at all. So I can see the mistakes. And I wonder how easy that is for younger lawyers to be able to recognise when it's wrong. Yeah. I mean, there's that famous case, isn't there?
Of course there is. There are quite a few examples. Exactly. I think that is really the trickiest aspect of this. And to my mind, for law firm leaders right now, and maybe for the next decade, I think we are in our existential crisis moment because generative AI in particular is an incredible tool, and we can absolutely teach our lawyers to use it, and we can even educate and teach lawyers how to make sure they're fact checking, make sure they are sort of checking every piece of information, if you will, that comes through that process. What I think we do risk is not that it's beyond the art of the possible. We will learn how to train lawyers to be lawyers with the absence of that repetitive, task doing that we all came up on. Right now, however, we can't even imagine how to do that. So the difficulty is we aren't trying. So we still train lawyers in much the same way. We expect them to, deal with our training programs in exactly the way that they did. And that's not just the trainees. That's really all the lawyers all the way through. But we now are adding all of these tools that they are learning on the side. And, again, that is great, and it is adding to the efficiency of what we can do. But it's not adding to what we really know lawyers provide. Ultimately, it's not
judgment.
It's judgment, exactly. It is definitely not black letter law. It is not. Anybody can go look that up now. If we thought we were going to get paid for that in the future, telling our clients what the law is absolutely out of question. That is not going to work. So it is judgment. It is judgment on not what is the law, but what should your action today be because of the law, or because of the circumstances you're in and the implications of the law. That judgment, as you rightly point out, it is so far honed by, many opportunities to over and over, make calls, move, watch the calls be made by somebody else, but, also do many either transactions or,
and people are more in the office as well in the past.
Yeah, and you learn from others, exactly. All of that,
prevalent.
Was, I think, training by osmosis largely. That's largely how we all learned. By osmosis and by on the job, right? We did it as we, did it. And we made mistakes and people corrected them and we, picked up and moved on. That is a much harder thing to do in this environment. You're right, not being in the office as much has an implication. I think we've got to get over that personally. I think we've got to embrace that and jump into how do we get people as involved and as engaged in the absence of being in the office.
Absolutely.
And how do we rethink what we are training lawyers to do and be in the future. And because that just doesn't feel like it's happening, I am very concerned about our profession, because I think we run the risk of it not being a profession. We'll be at consultants like everyone else, and that's fine. And you'll have, certain areas where lawyers can be great consultants and others where they're just not needed. And that is a big issue for businesses as we run them today.
And I think the law firm that begins that process of doing it in an entirely different way, embracing both remote working and embracing AI, and coming up with a new business model,
that's
really
the winner.
Lead the way. I mean, they may not ultimately be the winner, but everyone will follow.
Well, we definitely do that. Law firms all follow each other, so we definitely do that. And that is the problem, actually. None of us have really ever wanted to be first movers. That is the real challenge of this environment. When you have a bunch of lawyers that are waiting for, something to emerge as the way forward. Well, somebody's going to have to emerge and do it. It's not going to kind of arise. So I think that is, some of the risk of our history.
Go on, Tamara.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm quite, convinced that Reed Smith is one of those progressive firms thinking about it. So, which is a wonderful thing. But I think it's a tough challenge. It's
a very tough challenge. I can see that. Let's talk a bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Sure.
Now, Tamara, I know of you very well because of the 30% Club, which is 15 years, isn't it now, since it started. And I remember being so bowled over by the approach. One of the things, and maybe I've got this wrong, but one of the things that I thought was incredibly clever about the 30% Club was that rather than create all-women team trying to change for women, advocate for women, actually you as a group recognised that we needed to get to the chairs who were predominantly, at the time,
very predominantly
men.
Yes.
And the 30% Club is actually a bit of a play on the men's club, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly.
Because actually the club was actually of men.
It was.
Do you want to?
It was. Sure.
A bit more.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think, Helena Morrissey, who founded it, pulled us all together, was an absolute genius for this, because remains a great influencer, actually. And I think that was a big part of where she kind of came from. You can't make something happen. You have to make people want something to happen. And so, her approach, and indeed as we got together and tried to figure out what could we do, some of the things were sort of definitional. If we wanted to create change, we had to be able to track it. So we started with the FTSE and boards, because those were public information. Those were things we could get access to and know. But then the bit where you're absolutely right, it's very different. It is not, it's not a club of women. And I always feel a bit guilty when people ask, how do I join the 30% club? And the answer is be a chair or a CEO. That's how you do it. And you can if you're a chair or a CEO. And obviously your organization can be supportive, but that is the answer. And so it has always been a campaign, pretty much a single action campaign. I mean, I think we have, having had the pretty incredible success, if you think about it, there's plenty more to do, but incredible to see the numbers go. I think they were 10% when we started. I think there were about 12% of the FTSE where boards were women when we launched, and now we're at 42%,
I think it is. Yeah.
And that's a big change in a fairly short period of time. Clearly, a long time coming. And we've started to move out into, we're looking at CEOs, we're looking at, the executive pipeline. We're also, frankly, looking at ethnicity and, saying this definitely should not be, a group on a board of white women who are benefiting from this. That's not the talent that's out there. We've got a lot of talent out there, full stop. But in the moment when it was started, it was very single issue and very easy. And just to be clear, 30% it became a target because it was an easy target. It was a long way away. But it actually came from the research that shows us that a minority voice isn't heard until they are at least 30% of the group. And that's what we were aiming for. It was less about the number per se, but to get women's voices in the boardroom on the basis that would make a difference as you look down in the pipeline. And, you saw the organization start to change. Those women would be examples and role models. They would ask the questions that might make it better and easier for others. And so I think, that was the goal. But you're right. Our first 7 members were, of course, 7 brave male chairs who were willing to speak up and, frankly, were evangelical.
And I think I'm right in thinking that some of them had daughters about late 20s, early 30s. Right. And they had these incredible daughters that were beginning to run up against, the broken bridge, as I call it.
Absolutely.
They'd swept their way to that stage, and then woof, the bridge to leadership starts to look, much more difficult, doesn't it, roundabout?
Absolutely.
Once you get into your 30s, really.
No, you're right. And then Roger Carr is probably the most famous example, and Caroline Carr, who's just epic. So he was 100% right to realize how fabulous his daughter is. But yeah, I think, and I think that is, a refrain we hear often from male leaders, that they have daughters they care about, which I love, and I love that it works. I do often think, didn't you have sisters and mothers and wives first, though? So wouldn't it be great if we all just thought, the reality is we have loads of women in our lives, and they all deserve, to be treated equally. And
yes, the father-daughter relationship's very strong.
It is, no question.
And the thing about what I muse about is, so that single issue campaign involved men right from the start. How could that be applied to the situation we're in now? Because there's no question that the executive director movement has not been quick enough. And I've been a non-exec director on a board, and it hasn't got as much power.
No.
And it needs people to be in the big jobs as well. You've got to be in the CFO still, the chair and the chief executive.
Well, CEO, yeah, for sure.
Exactly.
Let's
those 3 big roles. Yeah. So those, and I think 30% Club's making that point. We still have to have more people in those roles as well. But it is about the executive directors as well, and it's not flooding through as well.
It was never meant to be, and that's what's fascinating to me. So I will go back to say, it's a bit like trickle down economics, and I'm an economist by background, and think it's a lovely thought, right? But it didn't work in practice. And so part of this, we were never aiming for non-execs, actually. Of course, we were aiming for directors. We never made a point of it being non-execs.
Really?
It's the world that seems to have decided women can be non-execs, but somehow exactly. And I think that's the problem. I don't want to see the non-exec role or the SID role these days, turned into the female ghetto, because again, like every other profession or business out there, when it becomes female dominated, they're paid less and they have less power. So that's not where we were going, right? but that was the easiest route. And so it was the easiest place for boards to make change, which means we haven't seen the trickle down that we'd hoped, because you're right, they don't have that. I know some non-execs, I know some female non-execs that
They've got a lot of power.
I would argue they have a lot of power, and they are amazing. So let's not, let's not generalize too much, but they have less ability to influence the executive pipeline in particular. They're not management, as we know. So, less ability. Now, they can be great role models. They can absolutely, and I'm sure you do in your non-exec roles as I do. I spend a lot of time with the women in the business because that's what I care about. And actually, the typically male CEOs or chairs know that, and they want me in that role, so that's great. So I'm happy to be there and be a role model, but it's still not the same as being in the room when promotion decisions are made. And that's where the executive make the difference, and that's where you need more women to be visible. But it's also role modeling that we should normalize seeing a female face when we see say CEO, and so and a female face when we say CFO, and those are the things that make a difference. And of course, we also know we need more women as CEOs, because typically, most of the time, we will see that, more people that are appointed to boards, particularly in the chair role, they have been sitting CEOs in the past. So you kind of need to see that progression. But to do that, we still need to normalize having women in those roles. And, that is still very much, is very much the aim for the 30% Club now. And as I say, we've kind of widened out into looking at the executive pipeline as a whole, and also widened out into thinking about, let's just make sure this isn't just one other narrow class of people that make it through, in terms of it be white women that get through. And so I think, those are important movements, of the needle, if you will, as well. It's, it's important, and it doesn't mean you're failing, but it does mean that, you haven't succeeded fully. And so you've got to kind of pick those pieces up and go, okay, this worked, and that we've got more to do on. So that's
and so given that, I would describe us today as being in a bit of a DEI backlash.
I think so.
It's really interesting watching different companies' responses to that. Law firms in particular.
I agree.
We both know that certain American law firms have been targeted directly to actually remove their DEI narrative from their websites. What's your thoughts on all of that, and what do you think? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and I will say, it's one of the few moments, because I did love being in leadership at Reed Smith. It's one of the few moments when I'm pleased I'm not in leadership right now, because those are really hard decisions and really tough issues to face. I think particularly as lawyers, I think a lot of lawyers feel, we are lawyers, we must respect the law. If the law says that this is something we can't do, then we shouldn't do it. And I think, I completely accept and respect that perspective. The flip side is, we are a profession, and if lawyers don't stand up for the rule of law, how could we expect anyone else to? And, that is easy to say and very much harder to do and put in practice. There are clearly firms that have, and there are clearly ways to do so. And so, I will say hats off to those firms for sure. They have taken big risks. But that does not mean, I look at, some of the firms that have made, deals with the Trump administration. Again, I think it's,
you're running a company, it's pragmatism.
You can't judge unless you've walked in their shoes. And the reality is, I think the only regret I would particularly say I have about the way this has all rolled out, as we look, across into Trump's first 100 days, and how it's affected law firms in particular, is that if we had actually stuck together, if we had actually, as lawyers, as a profession, said, we have a hard line on this. There is a red line, and we must, even if it hurts, because it hurts, frankly, because we've chosen this profession. Even if it hurts, we must find that line and stick to it. Then I think we might see a different outcome. And easy again to say that in the moment. That's not, what are you doing? You're ringing everybody up. You're asking, how do you actually kind of have collective action? And I think, I hope we will start to see that be some of the, the real answers to the issues we face today, is that people start to stick together and say, yeah, there is a backlash, but we're going to weather this storm together because we've decided where our values take us, and there is a line. Or in our case, in a legal perspective, it's where the law is and what an abuse of the law looks like, and how do we identify that, because that's something really we are uniquely qualified to do.
Absolutely.
And if we don't, then our profession will fall. And I think that is the biggest risk we face today. Certainly the rule of law is under attack, full stop. But if the lawyers as a profession don't stand up, that profession will cease to exist. It's that simple. And, it is existential, back to our, prior conversation. And it's a tough time to be a lawyer, for full stop, but it's certainly a tough time to be in leadership in a law firm.
But the executive orders are not changing law, are they? They're directional? And is that the essence?
They are law.
They are
law.
Okay, so
they are law. You comply or you are in violation. So it is. It's not a request.
It is actually a direction.
It is law. So and think about all the kinds of things that Trump has done by executive order. Those are laws, and that is the difficulty. So you could violate the law to try to protect the law. So.
But it's against the Constitution.
So, well, that would be the argument. And that is obviously, that's where
the argument that they're going for.
The cases that have thus far been won is that these are abuses of the law. But again, you got to get through all the courts. Things will be appealed. Who knows where that will land. And in the meantime, businesses are in limbo.
And the individual
clients
targeting.
are in limbo, because remember, this is easy to say. But, you have clients where you are, as a law firm, they might be acting for the client against the government, or, they might be acting for the client in a government contract and an arrangement. There are all kinds of things where the implications for what you can and can't do, and therefore who your clients can count on and not, are huge. And they are, as I think one of the leaders of the law firm that was facing the executive order said, it is existential for the law firm in the moment. And it was. And so that's why I say you can't judge people for the decisions that they make when they stand alone.
And it's as much for the accountancy profession too, isn't it? The big consulting, or do you think no?
Yeah, not as
because
much.
Law is actually about
the law. Exactly.
So
and I think
critical.
I think when we come back to your question around what is happening, what are companies deciding to do with DEI, and this idea that you must change your language. Again, language is language. I can probably get with that. I don't love it, because I think language still matters. But I can probably, live with that, as long as you are firm on where the values have you stand. And that still means there will be a line. There will be something that each organization will have probably slightly different values and different, places where they draw that line. But I think they need to know where that is. And, language can change. And I can certainly accept that, there are aspects of things done in the name of DEI that probably did
performative and weren't really effective.
Exactly. Or did go too far, did get a little bit, beyond performative, I'd say, and, into absurd. I'm sure that happens. Don't get me wrong. But I think when it comes to, do organizations mean or intend to be inclusive? Are they going to focus on the fact that, a lack of representation of, frankly, any aspect of society probably means you have a problem? There's some really fundamental basics you can get to that say, you don't have to call it DEI, don't call it anything, call it, thinking about how you
Lead.
how you lead, but also how do you interact with your clients or customers? If you're facing clients and customers who look very different and have very different backgrounds to everyone, in your organization, something probably is not going to go well for you. That's pretty basic, right? And frankly, business-led, which I think most of us have always believed DEI should be.
And absolutely, and I absolutely thoroughly believe it's business-led because I think of it as being about talent. So where is the talent going to come from? Since we know from in terms of graduate numbers, in terms of ones doing well in STEM, in terms of the numbers, they are actually not all coming from the Northern Hemisphere.
Thank goodness.
Absolutely
right.
So, in fact, to be able to get the best talent, you absolutely need. And the other thing I think is from an engagement point of view, I think generationally, younger people really do not want to belong to organisations that don't look progressive.
Agreed. Mostly. I have a Gen Z in my home who is very progressive. Now, I guess you'd say that's obvious because he grew up in my home. But, he's well beyond probably where I am in terms of that real, lack of judgment, full inclusive, total comfort with
gender fluidity almost,
I was going to say with his gender in particular, but, just kind of anything out there. And I think that's, I always find that quite inspiring, actually.
So do I, yeah.
So it does, to some degree, come back to, a lot of this has to be about, a place for everyone, right? Somebody has to accept that you can't have a world where, there is a sense of being completely excluded and think that's going to go well for you. All we have to do is look at history. When peoples are excluded, that does not go well. It leads to strife. So part of this is trying to, I guess, get to a place where we accept, actually, we need to hear some of those voices that are pretty abhorrent at the moment, particularly among these young men. We'll, for lack of a better place to go, call them the sort of Andrew Tate disciples. But I think you need to hear that as a cry for help, frankly.
And I think beyond the extremist, the kind of manosphere, it's also about listening into men of Gen X and Gen Y generation who themselves have had to lean into a style of leadership that not everybody has a strong agentic style. And I think for men, we talked a bit about how women actually have more choice of identity, whereas for men, that kind of man is strong, lack vulnerability. It's really confusing.
Big job, that's your job is your identity. All of those places, the box that we've put around men, and yet, we know that there are a lot of particularly young men, but also you're absolutely right, men of every generation that are finding that transition into that's not their sole identity very difficult. Or they're finding it even more difficult for that to be their identity in this day and age. And so, it's confusing. And I think that's, to me, that's the biggest issue we face is not, that it's a one-sided story, that we need to advance women and everything will be okay. We actually need to figure out a place where, men can be happy in this new environment we create, and women can be happy. And, I'm very fond of saying, women can only progress in the workplace, when men progress in the home. And the reality is men can only progress in the home when women let them, and women get to progress in the workplace. So it's the same privilege that they each carry in just different places. And so, more and more men want to be great parents. They want to be involved in their home lives. More and more men are, frankly, as in my relationship, my husband is far more comfortable. He was the cooking person. I stored sweaters in the oven. Like he was the person that did things, all domestic and had, glass cutlery, and I was happy with paper plates. So he was very happy in that home environment. But we didn't have a society that accepted, that he would do that. So we have to have a society, women included, that accept that. And women can be just as bad as any man out there about accepting a man who says, no, I don't work. I look after the children. I take care of the home, whatever it may be. But the same then happens in the workplace. The men who think this is their space have to give up a bit of space for the women who can progress there. But those two things really have to kind of go together. And, that is a privilege that we're all having to learn how to give up. And I think that's a tough place unless we can start to replace it with a vision that says it's not all lose. There's a way to win for everyone in all of this.
And how can we do that? Think in terms of the 30% club, single issue, involved men. What do you think might come through? What have you heard of that does actually work?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish there were a pat answer. I think, there are, we'll come back to where we started. Leadership is really what works. And the best things I've seen are, organizations that really lead from the top with all of this are very clear about, their inclusive behavior. Wonderful sort of authentic stories of CEOs that actually, got to CEO while working 4 days a week. Of leaders, men and women, who who look different, who have a different background, and who tell that story openly, and who are very comfortable with, their right to lead, frankly, and then, always role modeling that for people who, look like them, come from where they come from, have a similar background, etc. I think that's really the only answer, and it is, but it is possible. There are organizations out there, and then there are also, clearly people out there who are very comfortable with those changes in roles. And we all have to get there, and normalize it. We know we'll do it because all you have to do is go back, watch a 90s sitcom just for a few minutes, and you realize how much we've all gotten accustomed to what's changed, and how comfortable we now are in this world that is very, very different to that one. And so it is happening and it is changing, but we have some growing pains around that. Let's be kind and call what's going on, particularly in the U.S., a growing pain. But I think it calls people to decide what side of what line they want to stand on, right? Yeah. And the more you kind of get comfortable with saying it's okay to disagree, I want to understand your perspective, and let's try to figure out if there is a middle ground, rather than assuming we all have to sit so far away on very different sides of a fence, the more likely you are to get to a place that is in fact a middle ground where two things can be true at once in that space. And I don't think we're there in the moment, but I think I have hope that we can get there. And I particularly have hope that we can get there if we kind of keep listening and talking to each other and allowing disagreement and discourse and debate to happen, ideally without shouting, and ideally without name calling. But genuinely trying to understand, why do some of these, young men feel the way they feel? Why does middle America feel the way it feels? Why do we have leaders elected, that look like they do today? What is it about our society that's telling us that we need to listen to try to find those answers that then, speak to the people that are feeling excluded? Again, exclusion leads to strife, so let's not do it.
And I think it boils down to inequality, doesn't it? When there's inequality, then this is what happens.
Perceived or otherwise.
Perceived or otherwise, absolutely.
Yeah, agreed.
I had actually the pleasure of running that was part of a 3-day leadership course we ran, and it was 50% male and 50% female, deliberately in New York, would you believe?
Great.
And I know it was very brave. And we decided on the third day, we felt that the atmosphere was right to do a bit on gender equity with the men and the women in the room. So we divided them and asked them both the question, in what way does the system, and understand this, we did a bit of explanation what we meant by that, hinders men and helps men, and what we do, and we split it by gender. And then what we did was, using our coaching skills, we had already laid down the rules of the conversation about being, seek first to understand before being understood.
Sure.
And then it was fascinating. We had a trust circle with 10 men, 10 women. And of course, what they're describing are the same.
Exactly.
The problem is the same. What I find frustrating is, how do you get men in the room? Because we kind of forced that one. But how, or it was lucky, but how do you get 50%. If you did a leadership course, for example, now, you're going to get the numbers that are still massively biased towards men. And as soon as we have that leadership course with a higher percentage of men, the agentic nature comes in, whether the men are naturally agentic or not, or the women, it's still the cultural norm for leadership. So actually to be able to get the right, 50-50 in the room is actually really important. But how do we get them to come in? This is I'm president now of City Women's Network.
Sure, of course.
Which Brenda Trinoden, the lovely Brenda.
Indeed.
Brenda brought me in to City Women's Network many, many years ago. And Brenda obviously did so much on the 30% Club as well. Yes, City Women's Network. We're running a City Women's Network.
Yeah.
It sounds excluding, doesn't it?
I think that's one of the
tough.
issues. And I've struggled with this because I started a number of women's networks way back when it was very unfashionable. Frankly, around business development, funnily enough, I was trying to say, look, we women have to give each other business because the men are doing it. And so I wanted to find a place where, women, bankers, lawyers, accountants, rating agents, et cetera, would all get together and say, in my industry, let's know each other so that at least when it comes time to dole out work, we think of each other. And I was very adamant that was fine, that was a women-only group, because we needed a space that actually accepted us and accepted the kinds of things that we would do for networking, like the Goldsmiths Jewelry Fair, or, exactly. So it wasn't always about, golf. And I happened to play golf, but so I was happy to play golf, but that wasn't, what I think most of the women in the group wanted to do. So we tried to do that. I've moved, and I'd still defend the right for women to have some spaces because we're still addressing that inequality and some of the barriers that are unique to being a woman. And so that safe space, I certainly am very aware of it when I talk to, groups of young women who want to talk about awkward moments with clients who hit on them, or, what do you do when colleagues, hit on you and then exclude you, and those kinds of conversations they would not have in front of men. So I think we as leaders have to recognize we need to find those safe spaces. But the flip side of that is I always balk a little bit when I hear about we have a high performance women's leadership course we put women on. Okay, but then I worry. Okay, that's what you're saying. They're defective as women. They need extra help. They need like the remedial course. What are we saying? And the reality, I think, is what we are saying is we still have a bias in every place in our society, in our workforce, that mean women don't put themselves forward as naturally, and men don't even think of them as naturally, and women don't think of other women as naturally.
Exactly.
So, we have this whole problem we're trying to solve, but we're not going to solve it just by identifying the high performers that are female that we put into this special course. Instead, what you want to do is create all of your leadership courses with high-performing women and the men who would naturally have been there in the sort of leadership consideration, but you might be pulling those women, forward a bit. I think some of that has worked. I've certainly seen it work, where you're really all you're doing is telling the women they belong there. The reality is you're not actually suggesting that they are less qualified or ready.
Not at all,
it's just they typically haven't been thought of or put themselves forward in the same way.
Yeah.
But when you start to really focus on identifying those women and put them in the same leadership program with men, because the big complaint I hear now is men saying, we don't have a special leadership program. So why don't we get this extra treatment? Yeah. So I think it is right. You put that together, but then you start to say you're almost engineering it, not to be 50-50 because that's too artificial, but certainly to ensure that you've identified all of the high potential leaders, which by definition we know must at least include quite a few women. So, you start to get more and more of the women into those groups. Then you have a mixed group, you have leadership where they are actually having to interact with each other, and they're having to interact with each other, hopefully around some of these subjects more authentically, as you were describing.
I completely agree. I think it's so important that what's recognised is that women's potential is under-recognised because it doesn't necessarily look the same. Yeah. So in leadership programmes, what my experience is that we often get quite agentic female leaders who have been identified because they feel more like they
behave
fit
more
in
like
the system.
Men. Yes, exactly.
And so I think, whereas what's interesting is we know from the research is that more communal, men can make it through, but actually it's more difficult for communal women to make it through.
Yeah.
And so therefore more agentic women come through. And so, a lot of the problem is they don't put their hand up to go on these courses. We tried self-nomination with one client, and it was a women's only program, and the nominations really, really reduced.
Wow.
Because women are too busy to put themselves forward.
Well, that is another big problem. I think we've somehow, societally told women that there are things that, are fluffy and that they shouldn't do. That somehow if they sit at their desk, they do their job really, really well.
Conscientiously.
Really conscientiously, and they're very competent. This is the idea somebody's going to come along and pop a tiara on their head and tell them they're wonderful. Well, you're not going to happen. It's not going to happen that way. What's reality is, every office, every organization has politics, and yes, you have to engage in them. Yeah. It is important that you tell your bosses and those around you what you want, because people don't read your mind. It's amazing that. And it is not unseemly or unfeminine to do so, but it is important that you do it. And I think there's this whole sense of what we tell women about what they shouldn't be involved in office politics, because that's unseemly. They shouldn't be involved in networking because that's fluffy, and that's things that people do if they want to. It's optional. That's nonsense. Those are the things that networking is critical. But all these things we've told women, everything but their job that they do in the moment that's on their job description, everything else is fluffy and optional. Somehow men got a totally different instruction. They got the instruction that says, you've got to figure out who has the influence and power in the office and go work with that. You have to get the right people to notice you if you want to be promoted. You have to tell them that you want to be promoted. Those are all the things the men got taught. And I am not saying I want women to somehow become men, because I don't. I want women to be authentically themselves. But the number of meetings I've sat in where I've heard, well, she didn't really ever say she wanted to be, promoted, or, I've never heard her ask for that. That's unacceptable. We have got to learn that is the basis on which women judge other women as well. Because when we think about those promotions, the bias and the lens we're using is now the one that the men have been taught to do.
And
somehow.
we could look at that lens though and say, well, actually, maybe the person that puts their hand up first to do things
shouldn't always have the job. Qualified. I agree. It's like, and whoever wants to be in politics probably shouldn't be in politics, right?
So there's an element, I do think, of leadership, not expecting leadership to always have self-advocacy. And actually, leaders need to be a little bit more nuanced in how they recognise potential, and recognising that, you and I get it, that women have been conditioned. We know when we get too decisive or make too many decisions, we are going to get scrutinised more. We've learned that you can be assertive to a point when you're a woman, and then it becomes a bit aggressive, especially with the Scottish accent. However, younger women, that if there has been this socialisation to keep your powder dry, to listen more than to talk, to learn from what others are saying first, to go for consensus building, then actually I think those are traits that more leaders should have.
Oh, I completely agree. And I think let's be clear, I don't want to get into the, we need to fix the women, not the management or the system, because we definitely need to fix the management and the system. Yeah. But I think what we do need to do is both at the same time. So what I'm really advocating, I guess, is that, we're upfront and honest about what we think is required. What does it take to be a leader? In this organization? Be very specific. In this organization, what are the competencies? What are the skill sets? What are the soft skills? What are the extras we expect you to do? What are all the pastoral care and the training that we expect you to put in for other people? Because that's actually part of being a leader. Be honest about it all. Don't expect people to guess, because the women somehow don't get the same memo. And that's what makes me crazy, is that, somewhere along the line, there's like a special language that, the genders just have totally different reading of.
And I guess that's why I'm still an advocate for women programs, because I think they haven't had that memo. And also, I think collectively we could change that memo. to try and make it more acceptable as a leader, not to always be the one that has to speak first. Because actually, inclusive style of leadership is listening more. It's seek first to understand.
2 ears and only one mouth for a reason.
Exactly.
100%. No, I agree. And I think the only worry, and maybe this is coming out of our earlier conversation, you don't want to create the female ghetto. And those programs that somehow, when they're only women, if they become devalued in the organization or by the leaders, that's
or if it's
unhelpful.
Fix the women on the content.
Or if it's Fix the women because we're going to help you have more confidence, and that's all it is.
No.
I hate that too.
So do I.
But I that's my concern, is that we start normalizing the female style of leadership, and the only way you get to do that is put more women in leadership. It's really that simple. So pull them forward, put them in leadership.
Yeah.
Not before their time, because trust me, that's not the problem. No. The problem is that, they are not putting themselves forward, or you are not seeing them when they do.
Exactly.
And when
it's
we finally
looking
do,
from a systemic point of view, looking at what potential looks like.
Exactly.
And how it can be hugely gendered.
Yeah.
What that looks like if we continue.
Potential versus performance is the starting point, right?
And we know that's been rather a lot of research. Shows that
exactly right.
shows that doesn't always match, that performance and potential can be two completely different marks.
Absolutely
whether
right.
you're a female or a male. Tamara, we could clearly speak all day.
Exactly.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Agreed. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure.